There's a lot of wrong in the characterization of just these two statements that's going to underpin basically his and the entire conservative movement's misunderstanding on gender. Let's break this down as quick and effectively as we can while also being extremely thorough and hopefully getting across a point that unfortunately has missed a lot of people. He states gender is not your biological sex, but what your brain believes is your sex. Our brains are biological, so how could one's mental state be separate from our biology? And basically every aspect of this is wrong, including the mental state being separate from the biology. Now, this is complicated, but it's not incomprehensible. In fact, it's fairly intuitive. Bear with me, this will be a bit more in-depth than your second grade biology class. The issue with ER's characterization is with the premise itself, namely the way that sex is categorized operates on a number of bimodal spectrums of genetic variation, from our chromosomes to our eye colors to our heights. Have you ever seen a female taller than a male? Of course you have, because while men are generally taller than women, it is by no means rare to see exceptions. The thing is, though, we have thousands and thousands and millions of these variations for each aspect of our biology. Hair growth rates, amount of hair, tendency and placement of stored fat tissue, likelihood of heart disease, and different types of autoimmune complications. These are all things that are somewhat determinative of sex, but more so seen as increased or decreased likelihood depending on your overall placement on the bimodal graphs genetically. On this most basic level, separate from the apparent truth of just going in public and seeing genetic variation, is the fact that there isn't just XX and XY. There are people with XXY, people born with only one X, people born physically with external female genitalia but no womb, people born with a mix of both male and female genitalia, or people born with both ovarian and testicular tissue. Point being, on no level biologically do we cleanly fit into the average bimodal range of the selection of male or female sex. If you are a man, in every way you can think of, but shorter than the average woman, then you are genetically not in full alignment with the center of the male sex as a binary concept. Nobody is. That's why sex is understood to be a bimodal distribution. Millions of genetic variations with loose correlation around the general sex. There is virtually no one person who exists, or perhaps ever existed, in the perfect equilibrium average of every one of their sex characteristics. It's a likelihood smaller than nearly anything. I mean, just think, there's 8 billion people on Earth, and not one person perfectly fits the center of the defining averages of male or female in genetic characteristics. In other words, none of us fit it. So in other words, there's not a rule with a few exceptions, as it's sometimes framed with these chromosomal exceptions. Instead, we are all exceptions that, when pooled and cataloged by the millions, average out into generalized rules when placed on a graph. You know this when you line up kids by height in school, and guys generally tend to be higher and girls tend to be lower, but there's quite a few mixing in the middle. So, knowing this, go to Walmart or like a local park. You can prove the genetic variation yourself. Do you know someone with different eye color than you? Do you know someone with different hair color than you? Hair length? Hair thickness? Knowing this, why would we assume 100% of people and 100% of those 100% of people's brains genetically happen to land perfectly in the equilibrium of male or female? It's a childlike, ridiculous thing to take seriously for any length of time with a professional. But it's also very complicated to understand, as complex biological structures and science often is. So, how would a brain know that it aligns more with the male or female sex on a genetic and biological level? Well, ask it. If your brain is biological, and your brain is telling you it feels more comfortable in the presentation that fits more so with the stereotypically feminine or masculine, especially to the point that it makes you feel terrible to have been born into the sex or the body that you were, then it is unlikely for the brain to feel that way, enjoy these things, want to do such a thing if not genetically predisposed to in that way. After all, our personalities are entirely determined by a single area in our brain. Basically, every high school psychology course in the US covers the story of Phineas Gage, who in the 1800s took a beam through the skull and on a dime miraculously lived, but also miraculously changed completely as a person until the day that he died. We exist on a number of spectrums, but when we organize all of these genetic variations, the features create on a graph 2 mounds of general genetic variation. So, I know that was really fast, but that's genetic variation in sex, and how it can fall more or less on one side or the other for literally millions of different genetic components, and in extreme examples, may create things like visually distinct secondary sex characteristics or gender dysphoria in brain science. Not to even mention that people have done brain scans on MTF and FTM trans people and seen that the gray matter aligns more so with the sex that they desire to be mentally. Geez, sorry for this long tirade. But this is basically a pocket edition of debunking every anti-trans argument using actual facts and logic. But now we're on to gender. Gender as a concept are socially constructed guidelines and cultural details that associate with broader sex trends and beliefs of the culture and time. Girls wear pink, boys wear blue. This is not biological, and in different cultures and different time periods, the opposite things have been true, with blue being for girls and pink being for boys. We know girls to wear high heels and guys to wear flat bottoms and sneakers, except high heels were originally invented explicitly for men to specifically wear. Boys play basketball, girls do ballet or gymnastics. Nowadays, there are nearly as many women in women's sports leagues as there are men's. Back in the day, it was seen as mannish and not something that a woman should be interested in. Because these gendered aspects, while in some cases aligning with the average bimodal interests of male and female, was an average, not a rule. And on top of that, because it was socially constructed, this often led women to being seen as a second sex, a second class with less legal rights. Often, the averages making up general interests were used to compound and force people to fit more rigidly into specific boxes. This is borderline eugenicist thinking, because it is forcing genetic reality to fit into artificially constructed boxes rigidly and with little exception, rather than creating boxes that more accurately reflect the biological truth of genetic variation. When people mean gender, this is what they refer to. These socially constructed boxes that are mixed in with scientific half-truths and histories of willful subjugation of women as a lower class. Wanting to broaden these ideas more so outside of the rigid boxes isn't anti-science. It's keeping up with biological reality and a whirlpool of evidence. If you're still uncertain or think, well, surely gender ideas that we have somewhat formed more nebulously from genetics because they were the result of the average people creating them in a culture. This can also be disproven, because not only things like the high heel example that I already mentioned, changing in time and context, but also the existence of hundreds of mutually cohabitating cultures all across the planet that have sometimes similar, sometimes dissimilar, and sometimes completely different or opposing stereotypes associated with the gender in their respective cultures. This contradiction becomes even more apparent in languages with gendered masculine and feminine grammar. For example, the concept of a key in German is masculine, associated often with being heavy, rough, and hard, while in Spanish it's categorized as feminine, associating with small, intricate, and little. Same exact concept, a key, with totally different gender signifiers that actively contradict each other, hard-baked into two coexisting modern cultures and languages. If you watch my Persona 4 series, you may remember the third gender, but not really a gender, but kind of a gender that Japan had in the pre-Meiji eras. If you haven't seen those videos, the Persona 4 analysis series is definitely worth watching. Native American cultures also famously have additional gender signifiers other than man and woman, and different other cultures throughout time, both currently around and not, make such exceptions outside of just two as well. So, I hope that wasn't too much. You can always re-listen if you need to, and while wording it this way makes sense to me, there's probably other people who would explain it better to you. But if you think that you have absorbed the general idea of what I said, let's